So today, my guest is Kapil Kale, founder and COO of Tremendous. This is a fun one for me because I've known Kapil for quite a few years. We worked together at AngelList and we've become friends since then. So I've heard a lot of interesting stories about what he's worked on, and I'm super excited to kind of share those with you. Kapil, can you tell us a little bit about what Tremendous does?
Yeah, for sure. So Tremendous helps businesses and organizations send payouts to people. What most people in startups or even fintech don't really know is that payroll covers a very small percentage or a meaningful percentage, but not the entire set of types of payments that businesses send to people. For example, Google does user research all over the world, and they do it with hundreds of thousands of different users in different countries who are providing input on their next AI model or version of search. And in order to do that research, they need some way to be able to compensate those people. Payroll doesn't really work for that. So that's what Tremendous does, is we connect all the payment rails that people want to get paid by and make it so that Google can just upload a CSV with email addresses and amounts, and we take care of everything else.
It's cool. So it's interesting because we actually we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the talent market, how you guys basically built your platform, built the company to attract great talent. And then after that, kind of how you're evaluating talent. But it was interesting because this week I kind of had a front row seat to this. We were doing some work on our platform and that you guys are integrated in. And we saw that you guys had like 10,000 applicants in the last 30 days, which I messaged you saying like, this is a bug, right? We've broken something. You're like, no, this is how many we've gotten. So clearly, you guys are popular. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of how you're seeing the market right now? And has this changed over the last few years? And how much do you think it's because of the stuff that you guys have done versus how much kind of the market has changed overall?
Yeah, for sure. I think like that number right now of 10,000 applications is really a factor of one, we're a fully remote company, which means the pools of people that we hire from are anyone in North and South America, and occasionally people in Europe. Typically, anyone who's going to be willing to be available from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern and is more or less working US hours is like someone we're interested in speaking to. And that just makes our candidate pool like, 50, 100 times larger than a startup that is only hiring locally in Chicago, for example. The second thing is that we put up a few listings for roles that are sort of entry level. Like we have a sales development role up right now, which doesn't require very much experience. And so the pool of candidates that are interested in that role is like really quite high, and they're all applying to jobs. The third factor is that the job market, as you know, is really not in the favor of candidates at the moment. Candidates are spending a lot of time looking for jobs, and I think this is particularly acute in the tech industry, and that's made it a lot easier for us to find candidates that we really otherwise wouldn't have had access to.
That makes a lot of sense. So take me back a little bit, when you rejoined Tremendous in 2020, 2021, I'm sure the company was different, way smaller. And I remember you talking about how recruiting was kind of your first priority, kind of building that team, building that culture. Can you talk a little bit about what did you do to kind of start that process to rebrand yourself? And why did you even think that was an issue that you wanted to solve?
For sure. Let's set the scene for a second. This was probably November of 2020, which means that we were about 8 or 9 months into COVID. And Tremendous, from a business standpoint, was actually doing quite well. We had product market fit. We were profitable. And so when I had rejoined, part of my mission, my sort of personal directive, was to help make this company something that would be able to scale and expand its reach. And now, we're in the order of almost 10 times that right now, with roughly a little less than 10 times the number of people. And so we've accomplished that. But back then, as everyone, or at least you and I, are very familiar with the chaos of a 10 to 12 person organization, which is quite different than now we're, about 100, or I think we just hit 101. So that's really the scene for where we were when I joined. Your other question was, what made recruiting a sort of core priority? Well, back then, as is the case with, I think, most early stage startups, there's no recruiter on the team. That's not something that will scale to get you 10 times the size of organization, which is, we didn't know that we were going to get that big, but we knew we were heading in a direction where this was not going to work.
And so how did you think about this? Was there like, did you have a playbook or a strategy that you followed from, I know you guys focus, for example, a lot on your employer brand. Was that something that you knew you wanted to do from day one? Or can you take me through that process of like developing that strategy?
Sure. Coming from AngelList, which now has been rebranded to WellFound, AngelList had a big brand, and so we were always able to talk to people and at least have them be interested enough to take a conversation, and that would be the main thing that we want to do is like get smart people to actually have a first call, and then from there it's like you actually have an open dialogue with that person. The first thing we did was we were just not getting that many people in the door, and if you think about this as like a sort of funnel, the first thing is like, how do we actually generate like leads? And so the problem at the time was we didn't even have anyone doing that. And we were starting to, we were putting together a hiring plan and starting to see if we could get to like 30, 40 people, which was, tripling the size of the team. So the first thing we actually did was we hired a recruiter, which I think was like incredibly helpful. Because it solved the very top of funnel problem. And that's, I think, what you're leading to with where employer brand comes in.
Yeah. So where, like, what was kind of that realization, or what brought you to that realization? Your recruiter one day was like, look, I'm just not getting the hits that I expect. Or was that something that you kind of brought from AngelList? Like, hey, we used to reach out to this many people and got this many responses and we're just not getting that.
It's not quite a math problem that way. What we saw was that we were reaching out to similar types of candidates that at AngelList we were able to hire or at least have conversations with, and none of these people like were interested in talking to us. And there's no like stat for it. It's just like all these people I'm talking to like just don't seem like particularly compelling, and then the ones I talk to like have no idea what we do, and we spend a lot of time in that first call just like. So if I'm like to break down the things that worked for turning us from a brand that was like sort of unknown that people didn't want to work at to one that has, whatever, 10,000 applications in a week. The first thing that was really important was setting our recruiting market. And that meant saying that we were officially a remote company. We didn't have offices, and this is how we do remote.
Was that in relationship? Were you guys more talking about who you were already and putting that out there? Or was it more like, okay, we are solidifying the idea that we're remote because we think that's going to help us recruit? Like, what was the chicken egg thing here?
A little bit of both, honestly. But for us, it was like a combination of, well, for the founders, like we wanted to have a company that was remote so we wouldn't be bound to a particular location. And two is like, that felt like a way that we would actually be able to get the talent that we wanted. And it was like a competitive advantage. Yep. Even at that time when every other company was going remote, it still felt like, well, in order to compete, we can't just be recruiting in New York.
That makes sense. You mentioned kind of three big pillars here. So remote work, low meeting, and then kind of paying above market. Why those in particular?
We wanted to establish a culture that made people really happy to work at. And we needed the people who were at the company at the time to sort of conform to this new culture that we wanted to set so that when people joined, they wouldn't feel baited and switched because like we described one thing and then it was actually another. Like we actually had to do the work of making that culture a thing within our existing team. The next one is compensation. This was really simple. And I think, even at WellFound, like our philosophies on this were aligned. The best people in a particular field are not like, call it the 99th percentile, 98th percentile. They often are compensated at like plus 20% of like the mean compensation in that area. Whereas in like our approach was like, we should compensate them at what we think is like actually the 99th percentile. Or the 90th percentile. And so we set salaries for especially engineering roles to be at the 90th percentile of what like the comps were. And this felt actually quite uncomfortable because we realized that we were just paying a lot. But what that also meant was we were able to attract people to the company who would otherwise be like going to mid to late stage tech, like well-funded tech. And then the other consequence of this was like we just didn't want to hire that many people because the people that we had were going to be more productive anyway. And we didn't want to build like this headcount heavy company. So we ended up with a small team of people. But we targeted having a small team of people that were all sort of pretty senior, highly paid, and in aggregate more productive than like a large team of 50th percentile people.
One question here is like, how did you think about like competing against big tech here?
Yeah, we aren't like trying to take engineers that were working at Facebook or Google and get them to work for us. Because what I've typically seen is that when you go with like the engineers who are working at larger companies and who have a certain portion of their comp be entirely like liquid RSUs, they're often unlikely to want to go to a startup. But the ones who are really startup minded love to build, and they don't think that, this liquid comp is like worth working on stuff that's really boring and having. And so that's like a mindset thing. The other thing is in certain geographies, we were just outpaying people. And that's because our philosophy on paying people remotely was that we would pay at a small discount to US salaries. And so, for example, we recruited a bunch of early engineers from Carta, folks who had worked at Google, but they were based in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And as it turns out, they were getting meaningful compensation raises in order to come work at Tremendous. I think the people who came over got like a 40 to 50% raise. And that made the opportunity quite attractive.
And the other question I had was, I think one of the questions, like when people have a choice of a lot of different things to kind of do with their time, there's kind of like things that are super flashy and like close to like saving the world, and there are things that are like, this is a good business and stuff like that. And not to be not to like denigrate Tremendous in any way, but like it feels closer to like, this is a good business, it's not as flashy kind of thing. Was there a way that you were telling the story in a more compelling way?
I think that cuts down to like a differentiated story. The things that we had going for us were that we were profitable, we didn't have any outside investors, and our business was this sort of unsexy, like, we're dealing with the plumbing of payments.
Yeah.
In a way that Stripe is. Like, we think about Stripe as being this incredibly interesting company now.
Yeah.
But when they started, it was like, wow, you're going to go tackle this like ugly payments problem.
Yeah.
Now, as it turns out, differentiation in any form is like the valuable thing to build when you're trying to create a brand. Because if you look like everyone else, you're just going to look like a worse version of someone that's bigger than you, and that's uninteresting. Because they're like, any candidate that's interested in that thing that you're selling is, well, that's a better version, I'm going to go to that. But if you can create something that's a unique basket and you recruit from a large pool, well, there's going to be some subset of candidates that this is really going to stick with. And my best example on this is how we recruited the person who is now our VP of engineering, who you and I both know from the AngelList days, Magnus von Kohler, who is like a brilliant engineer, extremely uninterested in the shiny thing, like had no interest in going to crypto when crypto was in its when it was soaring and in its peaks, and people were trying to recruit him to those startups. But for him, he just wanted to work on like hard, sort of unsexy plumbing problems, and that meant that working at Tremendous was actually a really good fit for him over time. It was appealing enough that we got someone who was like, really brand name person we shouldn't have the ability to get because the value proposition was just different.
I think that's the thing that we've also seen a lot at WellFound. You get these early stage companies, maybe even like, 2-3 person teams, and they've kind of cargo culted this idea of like what big tech looks like, taken on all the processes, sell basically the same idea of working there, and then try to recruit the same engineers, and they do terribly, because it's like, well, yeah, there's a much better version out there that pays a lot more money, is more guaranteed, and it's like you got to lean into what makes you different. The last thing that you mentioned around that thing was kind of making sure that your existing team kind of upheld the new culture, which, it seems like there were some changes that happened, and you have to kind of move that team over. How was that process? It seems like that would be pretty difficult, actually.
It is difficult, because typically what that means is like setting the culture, saying like you are, the team is going to operate this way. And then the most painful part of it is like methodically going through all of the team members after some evaluation period and being like, is this person actually going to help us get to this medium term goal? Or are they like a sort of, in a way, like a relic of the past? And you want to be able to have time where you can coach them and make sure they understand what that standard is. But realistically, if the values of the company or like the operating principles of the company have changed, some meaningful percentage of the folks who had joined before didn't sign up for that, and you're going to have to part ways. And that's a really painful part. Some set of people are no longer going to be a fit for it. But the net result of it was like the people that were left were like really bought into this culture, and each additional person that we brought on like added to this, and it created this consistency of an operating environment that I think even though we're a full remote company, like we just had an offsite in Montreal last week, like everyone who goes to that offsite feels like they're like-minded and
Yeah.
like working on the same thing. It feels like a team in a way that it didn't before.
Losing a large number of your team members is quite a one-way door. Like, how certain were you that this was the right way of going, and like what gave you that kind of confidence and certainty?
I was not certain, but I was confident, which probably describes a lot of how I operate
Sure.
in general, probably to your experience. I think that we were pretty convinced that what we had was like not the way to proceed,
Hmm.
and it was just going to result in problems.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like this sort of top down, this is what we're doing.
Sure.
It was more like, wait, this person's not meeting the standard. This person's not meeting the standard.
I
What are we
see.
doing?
Right.
And it felt like a lot of the team was turning over at the time, but each individual decision felt like the right one.
So, kind of shifting gears a little bit. Now you've kind of built a brand. You have all these people applying, people are referring and stuff like that. Like, it's awesome. You have a lot of people that you can kind of choose from, but now you have to evaluate this kind of massive pool. So, on that front, I'd love to hear from you how you think about evaluating talent. How do you go through these thousands of profiles to figure out like the right fit for you guys?
Yeah, I think like from a funnel perspective as a candidate, the first step is how do I get to a call with someone?
Yep.
And then after that, it's how do I stand out
Yeah.
during the interview process and present myself as being the right fit for this role. And so I think we probably start with the first one. One thing I'll say is that the most compelling thing you could do is have like enough positive or interesting experiences in your background that like in a 2-second skim of your profile, like a recruiter will react like okay, this is someone I want to talk to. And it's simple things like that you can do to increase your chances of making that impression. One, make sure your profile is like filled out enough and like looks reasonably professional at the top. So like actually have a picture, for example. Like we've hired people who are just, the sort of standard avatar on LinkedIn or well found, but it's still like a meaningful differentiator to just have a fully completed profile. The second is like actually describe what your experiences are so that if something does happen to pique the interest of the recruiter, they can read a little bit more about it without it being too verbose. So just like write clearly and make sure the information is there. But I wouldn't spend a ton of time on like the application message or something like that or cover letters. Like honestly, in many ways, it is a numbers game. The other thing you can do that I've found is compelling is like if you know someone at the company you're working at, get them to refer you because from my perspective and our sole recruiter's perspective, there's a lot of noise and it's not easy to cut through.
Right.
So, in this market, anything you can do to just make sure that if someone glances at your profile, it gets seen or it gets processed is going to be helpful.
Is there anything you would like recommend at this stage when kind of there's so much on the candidate side or so much lopsidedness in the market? Like we hear things like, put like random keywords in your resume, but like make them white instead of black. So, it like blends in with the background. So the ATS software doesn't picks it up and puts it at the top, which I don't think works. Are there things that you guys do to kind of process that could help, these candidates as they kind of get these different types of advice?
I think the most like reductive way to explain how people look at profiles is imagine you have like your name and your LinkedIn bio, which maybe it says like senior recruiter at Stripe.
Yeah.
They're making an initial sifting decision basically just on that bio. And so
Right.
make sure that bio text is like mentioning the most compelling part of your work experience. And unfortunately, at this stage, because there's so many applications and you have limited information, it's like entirely like I'm doing a little bit of matching on credentials, which is like what companies have you worked at, what roles have you had, and like what's your educational background and years of experience, and like
Yeah.
compressing that into a 2-second
Yep.
assessment to figure out yes or no.
Like, okay, you've gone through this kind of, huge kind of culling through the funnel at the early stage. You've gotten a call with you guys. What helps people stand out there? Like, what do you think about when you interview candidates? Like, do you guys have a like rubric? Like, how does that like look when candidates are going through that process?
So typically for a role, the first call that happens is it's typically with Caitlin, our recruiter. Sometimes it may be with the hiring manager, but that's like an informational call. And the best way and we actually do have quite a bit, like our rating system for candidates is like strong, no, yes, strong yes.
Yeah.
And we do have a fair number of people who just in this informational call will come across as a strong yes. Most people are like yes or no, but sometimes they're like, oh, wow, this person really seems like the perfect fit for this role. And typically what that means in order to get a strong yes is one, before this call, you've sort of done meaningful research on Tremendous and you understand why it's a good fit. And let me put it this way. We spend a ton of time putting content about how our company works out there. If you in turn have like digested that content and actually understood what kind of environment we are, done a little bit of research about, it could be features that we've launched or something like that, we will know. And that comes across. So putting time and effort into that is one thing. Two is communicating clearly. We found that folks who are really good at working at Tremendous tend to be very good communicators. And that's an easy thing to assess for. Then the third is just having the right vibe of like coming across as like smart, curious, but also incredibly nice and easy to work with.
Do you have like an example in your head of like someone that was kind of a strong yes and what they did specifically to kind of like really stand out?
The second PM we hired was actually straight out of business school. Her name is Denise. And when I spoke to her and just learned about her experience, I was immediately like, wait, this is an ideal candidate for the job. And I put down a strong yes. And I'd done nothing from like a case perspective. It was just an informational call. But you could tell that she had the technical experience and experience building products. She was looking for this sort of exact role. She had worked at Google the summer before, and she came with a really strong recommendation from one of our engineers who had worked with her at a previous job. And so that was like, and she'd done her research on the company. So all that together was like, oh, wait, this person is actually going to be a really good fit for the role. So me as a hiring manager, even though I had no assessment of her ability, just had a really good feeling.
That makes total sense. Do you guys have a philosophy on what you're looking for and how you find it for something like engineering?
Yes, we do. So for engineering in particular, our first interview it's an interview we used at AngelList. It's like a very simple coding interview, and it's like, it's not quite FizzBuzz, but it's maybe 2 levels above, but it's also not like a leet code problem. It's not a hard algorithms problem. It's not a sort. Actually, nix that. It actually technically is a sort, but it's not like implementing a bubble sort or something like that. And what we're looking for is just a general fluency in being able to write code and reason about certain things associated with that code. That's like a really baseline thing that actually disqualifies a fair number of candidates. The next stage, which is the more time-intensive one, is like the one that we get a lot of signal on. And what we do is we actually send candidates like a toy code base and ask them to write a technical brief for how they would implement a change. And then when they come on site, we ask them to implement like a specific backend change and a specific front-end change and present the technical brief. And that together, which is, it's done in a fashion where you submit the technical brief before you come on site. Then your first half hour is discussing that technical brief with our head of engineering. Then you spend 2 hours in coding. It's async coding. So you are in a Slack channel with an engineer on our team working on a problem that's like basically submitting a pull request for some backend code. And then you do the same thing for the front end. And each of these like sort of async sessions come with like a 5-minute kickoff with the engineer to do Q&A. And then there's like Slack conversation that happens in the middle where we're paying attention in a private candidate channel. The thing overall is that this simulates what it's like to work at Tremendous really well. And we've found that since we moved to that type of interview, our success rate with hiring engineers and having them actually be good fits for the job is like gone to, I think it's like almost 100%.
That's awesome. Are there things that you can kind of reveal to us that gives us a better sense of like how that process looks like on the other side?
So for the technical brief, the first thing we look at is the actual brief, the actual writing. Is it clear? Is it concise? Or is it wordy and like you have to work hard to read through, like understand what the person is saying? And so the first sort of green light is, believe it or not, someone who is like clear and concise in their writing and can use the medium, whether it's Markdown, Notion, whatever they're writing in, well, to like actually communicate their ideas. That's indicative of, oh, you're going to be successful in a remote environment where you're not always in the same room as someone else. So that's that. The second is, are the technical ideas like correct and well defended? And we give enough context. Like, I don't think there's one answer, but correct it's not always the case that they're going to be the exact right thing that we're looking for.
Right.
Well defended is a non-negotiable. Like you need to have good reasons for why you chose what you chose. And that's like consistent with our value around intentionality, which is like at Tremendous, the expectation is that whatever work you do, you're actually able to explain why you chose that approach. And then the third is like, are you able to speak like in a pleasant, professional, and like a productive manner with our head of engineering? I think most people actually pass that part, but occasionally there's a few where it's like, that this is not going to work too well.
One last question before we go. So what's your life like now that, you've built a team from 10 to 100, you've kind of built it to the culture, the market's in your favor. Like, how are you kind of thinking about spending your time over the next 5 years and stuff like that with the company?
I'm doing this podcast with you.
So more free time, it seems like, basically.
No, I mean, so my role day to day now is I manage our product team. So for product managers, indirectly our engineering and design teams, we have leaders in place there, and then also our recruiting org. And just the amount of stuff that comes up within those organizations is quite time consuming. I'm still like actively reviewing almost every piece of product that goes out. From both like the sort of conception stage of like what problem are we solving to the approach stage to like, I even go and chip in on QA. And then there's like the other aspects of leading a 100-person org, helping with recruiting, whatever it may be, is pretty time consuming. So it's like increasingly hard to point to like one specific thing that I do, but it feels like I'm still adding value. So that's a good thing, I guess.
That's cool. Yeah, I guess there's always like other problems to solve when you're kind of running a startup, so it makes total sense. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kapil.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.